So I'm very happy to be joined by a great panel of experts who have been working on studying community and stakeholder engagement for many, many years, actually. So I'd like to welcome Laurie Dorfman, the director of the Berkeley Media Studies Group, who has a very long history in this field. So I think we're going to get a lot of great and rich insight on the past 20 years, maybe more, with very sorry, I'm outing you. And then we've got Toniesha Taylor, who is an associate professor at Prairie View A&M University, and Goyland Williams, adjunct professor of public speaking at New York City College of Technology. And they've been doing very interesting research on movements in a very current context. So I'd like to turn it over to Laurie first to talk a little bit about her work and kick us off.
Age before beauty. Okay. So, all right. Good afternoon, everybody. It's really been a pleasure sitting with you and listening to the wisdom come out of each table. I have to say I was pretty nervous about this panel because of its title, New Strategies for Engagement. From what I can tell, they're pretty much old strategies of engagement. We just have to do them more, better, and the same with renewed intensity and renewed interpretation depending on the issue that we're addressing. I'll just give you a quick statement about how we have approached our work, and then we can, do you want me to pass the mic down, and then we'll have a conversation, I guess. So the engagement that we work on at Berkeley Media Studies Group really has to do with the intersection of communications and public health. And we're interested in this intersection because when you study public health, as you all know, we've been talking about health equity all day, you learn very quickly that if you want to improve population level health, you have to improve the environments in which people live. And you have to understand how those environments came to be and what keeps them that way or what can change them. And when you study that and understand that basis, the root causes for public health problems, then you want to have a conversation with the people in power, the policymakers, generally speaking, who keep things the way they are or who can turn those levers and change them. And so what we do as a public health group is we study the news media because we want to understand that dominant narrative and the way the stories are told and the way we tell stories about ourselves to ourselves, because those are the stories that are influencing what the policymakers hear. So when you study the news, you're looking at what's there and how it's being characterized. But if you're coming to it with an analysis from public health, you're also looking at what's not there. And that helps you understand where the gaps might be and how you might have to retell a story or inform a policymaker. And it's not just about how we communicate to policymakers, because the messages aren't separate from the messenger that brings them or what they are about. So for us, messenger, audience, and message are all part and parcel of the same thing. And you can't really separate the message from the power of the people who are bringing them. So those two things have to be intertwined. So we take what we learn in the news analysis and we apply that to the second thing we do, media advocacy and strategic consultation. The idea there is to help people have the courage of their convictions, essentially, so that the first time they're having that very difficult and high-profile conversation with a policymaker or with a journalist in order to reach a policymaker, it's not for the first time. And they've thought about that. And so the training has to do with the strategy so that they know what they're asking for, they know who their audience is, and you don't have the media tail wagging the policy dog, as it were. And the other part of that is about framing, and gets back to what Marjorie said about the dominant narrative. Because if in the news analysis what we learn is that pretty much we have stories about heroes, people or heroines, given what we're talking about, who have overcome great odds, That's a wonderful story, but in fact, might do more harm than good if what we want to do is change the odds. So that's the framing dilemma that we always have. How do we get from individual stories, which we connect to, which journalists want to tell because they believe that's how people connect, to a larger social landscape and policy landscape. And our work there is mostly with advocates in the media advocacy training to help them do that and help them say what they want to say in those high-profile situations. And also, we do a little bit of work with journalists. From their perspective, if the advocates are the sources of the stories, the journalists are the ones who are asking the questions. So from the perspective of women's wealth and health equity, are they asking the right questions? And if not, what should those questions be? And who should they be asking the questions of? And so that's how we think about the power of the media to help activate and engage stakeholders in a very long but important process that is going to have moments in time that need to be highly visible and highly vocal. So I'll stop there, and Deepthi, shall I? Is that what you wanted? There? Yeah, okay.
There we go. Good afternoon. I am Dr. Toniesha Taylor. Goyland and I work together, have started working together in the last year to do a lot of big data, digital humanities projects. So we kind of start off our talks always with a little bit of shameless self-promotion. So you'll see on the screen, I think it's over there, you can follow us on Twitter. We're both on Twitter. I am at Dr. Toniesha T. And then Goyland will also talk a little bit about his projects, but he's at Goyland W. The research that I do in digital humanities and communication looks at how we can use communication and rhetoric, particularly, to do large-scale message analysis. So since I was trained as a rhetorician, I'm trained to do analysis of speech and media. So that means looking at large speeches. My dissertation work and my master's thesis work all looked at sermons as political and cultural discourse, and the way that people use, especially women, use the pulpit and sermon delivery as a way to talk about political advocacy and ways of changing culture and cultural space, and the power of the pulpit as the church pulpit as a bully pulpit for political discourse, right? What I've gotten into more recently is still looking at how women particularly, but people in general throughout sort of the African diaspora, use a lot of different modes of communication in order to engage in political activism. And so what's really exciting is looking at Twitter, for example, to look to see if what we imagine as an interpretation of a cultural event is the same as what people are actually saying about a cultural event. So Goyland and I worked on a project looking at the hashtag Charleston Massacre and the response to President Obama's eulogy after those murders. Now, if you looked at and did a traditional rhetorical analysis would have told you that as a population, particularly the Black population, was completely ready to forgive exactly everything that happened 7 days after it happened, because that's what the eulogy did, and that's what the media said, right? If you go beyond that and look at Twitter and what people were tweeting about, what you found out was that that was not at all how people felt. No one was ready to forgive. No one was ready to move on. No one was interested in that at all. People were interested in justice. They were interested in talking about the limitations of forgiveness, but they absolutely were not interested in forgiveness. They were not interested in grace. They weren't interested in any of those things. Something we never would have figured out if we weren't looking at big data. So my other projects all look at race and class and gender and political advocacy and the way that people are talking about those things, and using Twitter as an organizing mechanism to have those conversations and also engage in that kind of activism.
Hi, everybody. Goyland Williams here. Laurie and Toniesha kind of took all my research. So most of what I do is also very similar to also what Toniesha and Laurie kind of talks about. But in a quick word, most of my research grounds the work that most of either Black Americans in how cultural rhetoric sort of inform how we confront power and how we speak truth to power within in community responses as well in a more like activist way. So initially my research looked at sort of Michael Brown's case and how the community responded to that terror and that suffering, and how suffering oftentimes informs the ways that we communicate not only internally, but the ways that people of color and those most isolated and most on the margins also communicates with not only media, but communicates also with sort of those who are perceived to make some type of change agents. So that's where my research initially goes. I'm looking at sort of political discourse. Now we're in, the sort of presidency of Donald Trump, and so a lot of that is impacting the ways that we're talking about policy now, right? In the ways that informs not only the political choices that we make, but also the understanding of how we can make some type of change, and what does that change look like? So I'm really interested in the ways that we're talking about political violence and political nonviolence. What are the rhetorics of that? So looking at cultural rhetorics, right? Not necessarily the dominant narratives, right? Or the rhetorics of the communication patterns that happen between people who we necessarily don't think about, right? What are those people, how are those people left on the margins, and what is the margins, and what constitutes valid communication patterns? So that's kind of where my research is, so building off of the wonderful research that these ladies have already talked about.
I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about the tools that you use in your research, because I think that there are a variety of tools, and we're seeing that set of tools change.
The tools. There's a lot to choose from here. The basic tool is monitoring the media. So whether that is big data sets like you find in Twitter or on Facebook, or whether it's just the daily news, one thing you have to do is figure out a mechanism to be informed about the things that you care about. So whether you're doing that as an individual, so you're making your own lists on Twitter, so there's a set of journalists you want to talk about, or people who are talking about a particular issue you want to talk about. What we do at BMSG is keep a couple of different monitors going that any of you are welcome to join. We have one newsletter called In the News that comes out daily, and it covers all the issues that we care about, that we happen to be working on the time, from health equity to junk food marketing that targets kids of color, another big project we work on, to a lot on childhood trauma and community violence, guns, reproductive rights. There's just a wide variety. We define public health very broadly, of course. So in that digest, there are probably 6 to 10 little news blurbs that come out each day, but what we do with that is think about how that news is projecting the issue and what's missing from it, or did an advocate do an especially good job of making the case with numbers that translated well. We call it social math, when people are trying to translate big numbers that can make people numb, or if they are expressing or if something was missing, if a journalist left out a whole perspective, like the kinds of things when the criminal justice stuff comes up all the time, but you don't hear the very simple thing that Sylvia said in the session before about people might make 35 cents an hour but have to pay $10 for a phone call. So we try to call out either what's missing or what's been well done in the news, and that's useful because when advocates then go to talk to their constituents, to legislators, they need to know that kind of stuff. So that's a basic tool, and we have a couple of different newsletters, all the way up to our tools about how to analyze news with the idea of telling the story about the system instead of just the individual. So one of the things we talked about in our group that Marjorie mentioned before is that when we have the data we have about these disparities in wealth, it's from collecting data on a bunch of individuals and then putting that together as evidence for a system being broken. But we have very few tools to understand how to query the system itself. Some of those tools are historical. People need to know the history of the systems. That's why the red line tour is going to be so important, because that's going to elucidate a history. What we've been trying to do in our analyses of news coverage is figure out if intersectionality is true, I think that's true. If sectors need to work together to solve big problems, like as people have approached in health and all policies, I think that's true too. If both those things are true, then the issues we care about ought to show up in every beat in the newspaper, if you will. So we've been investigating violence and childhood trauma, and instead of just looking at crime stories, which we've studied for a really long time, I'm that old, 20 years of studies, I know what those are going to look like. I know we don't see solutions enough. I know they scare the pants off of people without showing them what solutions are. So I didn't want to study crime stories again when we were trying to figure out how to do better with violence. So instead we created a tool that said, okay, if the social determinants of health are right, shouldn't we see stories about childhood trauma in education stories? Shouldn't we see them in business stories? So we created tools that allowed us to examine, based on the data out of the epidemiology, whether those stories were showing up in those different beats, and if they were, what did they include? If they weren't, what was in the stories already that could link, maybe with one more question from a reporter or one more statement from an advocate, to broaden that story. So we're talking not just about the individual portraits of problems, but the whole landscape on which those portraits sit. So we have various tools that could be available to people who want to do those kinds of inquiries or understand news a little bit differently that I'd be happy to share.
The tools that I use tend to be open source. In doing big data, when you're at a university that looks at big data, especially social media data, and says, I don't get it, right? Also, we don't know if we want to pay for that, right? Then that means you have to figure something out, right? God bless open source and all my friends who work on open source stuff. So I use open source software called Tags, TAGS, which can be used by any nonprofit organization, university, or other entity. That's actually what their tagline of TAG says, for academic and social research. You cannot use it if you are a for-profit organization. You can't use it for business purposes, but you can use it as a researcher or as someone working in the nonprofit sector to find out more information about a particular hashtag that's showing up on Twitter. What I really love about it is it's super easy to use. All you need is a Gmail address and a Twitter account. Yay, you. So your Twitter account has to be public. You can use it can be a personal account, it could be an account for an organization, as long as it's clear in your profile that you are a nonprofit or working for a nonprofit. The folks at Tags worked to create the software with Twitter, and that's actually their agreement with Twitter, is that it won't be used to advance any particular corporation or business endeavor. Because what Tags does is, I'm gonna get real technical in the language here for a second, it scrapes out of Twitter's API all data in the API. So the API, how many of you guys use Twitter? Anybody use Twitter? Twitter users, yay. All right, so whenever you send a tweet, you send out anywhere from 100,000 points of data. And in that includes all kinds of things like your exact GPS location with the exact latitude and longitude of where you're sitting at the moment that you send the tweet, which can be really scary if you're an activist doing social justice, street level activism, but there it is. It also includes a lot of other kind of data points, like the kind of phone that you use, your carrier that you use, along with the actual text of the tweet that you sent. So Tags actually scrapes all that information when it collects the tweet. So all you have to do is set it up to look for a term or a hashtag. And then what it does is it pulls all of that information into a Google spreadsheet and it gives you that information. So it gives you the unique user ID. Every tweet that you send has its own ID number. Every user has its own ID number. It gives me the tweet itself, those 2 ID numbers, the GPS location. It gives me your bio that you have on Twitter, your avatar that you're using on Twitter. It also gives me information. If you told Twitter your age, it tells me that. If you told them your race, it tells me that. All of that information comes with your tweet. So it means that for me, I have to think ethically and equitably about how I'm using this data, which is why I only do big data analysis. I'm not looking at one person, because that's a lot of information about a person that they probably didn't even know they were sending out into the world like that. But that's a tool that I use in order to find out what people are thinking about, what people are talking about. Then I use another tool called Voyant, which is a content analysis tool. So I take the body of the tweet and I put that into all of those tweets into Voyant to find out what are the most used words, what are the most frequently used words within a particular body of tweets. So that's how, for the project Visualizing Grace that Goyland and I are working on together, that's actually how we suspected that audiences weren't as forgiving or as interested in grace as the media portrayed, but we didn't really know for sure. When we put the body of the tweets into, we used about 1,500 tweets, we found out for sure people were not interested in what the media thought they were interested in. And so those 2 tools together can be really useful, because it can help you figure out what Laurie is talking about as far as, is your message that you're developing reaching people? So when people talk about your message, are they talking about the thing you think they're talking about? Or are they talking about something completely else? So you can use tags to scrape Twitter to find out what people are saying on social media, and then you can use Voyant as a tool to do analysis to find out if the message is really hitting where you think it's hitting. And so it can be really, really useful and very, very interesting. And I can show a little bit more about that as well.
Thank you, Toniesha, for that. So I won't really talk about the tools that Toniesha and Laurie have talked about, because those are in addition to those. I use those for my research. But I'll talk about more so what I'm looking at now and what I've kind of always sort of looked at. And that's, I try to view communication as not from a deficit, right? So a lot of times when we're talking about equity research or intersectionality, a lot of times we're talking about deficits, right? What don't we have, or what is keeping us from accessing X, Y, and Z, right? But a lot of times I want to think about the ways that certain communities, specifically communities of color, what do we bring to the table? So what are these cultural, right, aspects that we bring? What are these performances that we bring? What are these communication styles and forms of identities, right, that we already bring to bear on X, Y, and Z? So looking from that, I think a lot about persuasion at the intersection in content analysis, and the ways that what does persuasion look like for a community of color who's also spiritually inclined, who's also a people of faith, who's also a people who's strongly connected to music traditions, Black music traditions, who's also connected to sports, who's also connected to, right, other forms of participation. What does that participation look like? Whether that manifests itself on Twitter, right? So we have a lot of research now, as Toniesha has talked about briefly, a lot of the research that we're talking about now is Black Twitter, right? And what is Black Twitter, right? So more scholars in the field are being able to define Black Twitter as a valid form of communication, as a phenomenon that's happening and that's been happening forever, right? So it's bringing back research. Henry Louis Gates talks about signifying. What is signifying in the Black tradition, and how does that inform the way that we talk about activist research, and talks about cultural communication? How do people of color historically, how have we communicated, right? So we talk about both the seriousness and the folly, right? We talk about the fragile and the fickle, right? And we talk about form and content at the same time. And we don't necessarily see a sort of separation between the secular and the sacred, right? And so most of my research is grounded in understanding communication at its base level and not necessarily looking for, well, how does people of color in this class communicate? How do people of color in, who are in the margins communicate? A lot of times I'm looking for common ground. What are these common ground types? We use persuasion. We use language. We use language, and that language manifests itself in our music, in our performances, right? In our style, right? All of that it must bring that to bear against policy action. Right, and we have to think about those types of considerations when we're talking about the ways that activists or non-activists, right, communicate around issues that matter to that community or issues that matter to that person. Right, so I try not to get so much grounded on talking about rhetoric as this sort of Aristotelian understanding of rhetoric, talking about ethos, pathos, and logos, but thinking about rhetoric as a basic form of identity. Who are we as a people? We know that for large parts, Black people in the United States, for a fact, have seen themselves as having this sort of linked fate, right? As this shared fate, right? That where I go, you go, types of understanding of communication. And so a lot of times our communication patterns have been grounded to that understanding, right? If I do this, if I move in this type of way, this could also impact not only my children, but my grandchildren, but it also can affect other Black people, right? So this is where a lot of times the research me and Toniesha are talking about, specifically respectability politics, comes into play, right? I'm very conscious of the language choices I'm using even here now. I'm very conscious of the way I'm dressing even here now, because I know that other people of color who look like us but who don't necessarily enjoy the same access and privilege that we have, also know that how you view them matters on what I do here today and their life chances. So we have to talk, I think, more seriously about that, right? And how this linked fate sort of mediates, right, how other people in the community also, the chances that they have to access certain communities and certain forms of privilege and power.
Thank you, Goyland. That was extremely wide-ranging, and I think brought out some really interesting areas that we could dive into. I want to talk a little bit about movements before we open it up to the audience. Specifically, some of the newer movements that we've seen have extremely diverse approaches to how communities enter into those movements, and then how those movements move policymakers and the larger community. So, Laurie, if there are any examples of, I think, thinking about Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, some of these more recent movements that you'd like to talk about how community and stakeholder engagement has manifested within those.
So let me give you a little example and a big example. The big example will be Black Lives Matter. The little example that I'll start with is about soda taxes. So soda taxes are starting to ignite in this country, which makes me as a public health person very excited, because we have such a grand history from the success of tobacco taxes that we hold out great hope that soda taxes might have an equal effect on people's health, especially in communities that are suffering from wild raging diabetes, and we know that sugary beverages are associated with that. And the little story is that in California, which has kind of been a hotbed for this stuff, there were several failures, and one of the failures was in Richmond, California, where one of the big divisions there was around race. And that community has a long history and a lot of aspects to that history, but the community didn't really come together there, and the industry was able to use historical divides in the city of Richmond to quash that tax. In Berkeley, California, there was a much different process that was very cognizant of what had happened in Richmond, and also was very cognizant of that relationship I spoke about before between power and community organizing and media advocacy, understanding that the media side is in service to the community organizing and the policy advocacy, not the other way around. And they did their organizing up front and first, and they cultivated leadership across various communities in Berkeley, California. So there was a united front of people who were listening to each other, who came to the table together, and who made change that is now the domino that is setting off dominoes all over the country. And that was in the small community of Berkeley, and some people might think Berkeley's a little outlier, but in fact, Berkeley has been an instigator in the past. Berkeley is the place in the nation that had the first curb cut in the nation, so somebody in a wheelchair could leave their home and go out in the community. So it's a place where things start. And so we were very proud of that, and proud to be engaged, and proud about how the leadership around that advocacy was constructed and how multicultural it was. And I think that's a little tiny local example that was well done and has national implications. The Black Lives Matter movement is fabulous and fascinating and an inspiration. And there's a wonderful case study that I would highly recommend that you might be interested in if you want to see some of the background of that. There's a lot been written and there's a lot of action on it right now. There's two things that I'll talk about. One is this little case study, and then the other thing I want to just mention is the movement for Black Lives. And I'm really on the periphery of this. I'm really telling you about this not as a participant, but as an observer and somebody who's very interested and hopeful about the outcomes that people are seeking in that movement. So the case study comes from another tool you guys might be interested in. It's called Media Cloud. I don't know if you all have seen Media Cloud. Okay, so Media Cloud is also trying to scrape the universe of news so people can get a handle on what's going on. And it's very hard. My hat's off to Toniesha and Goyland, because dealing with big data is not easy, because the terms can get interpreted very differently, and so I can tell you stories about that too. So it's really hard work that these guys are doing, but really important. And the Media Cloud work is very similar, where they're trying to figure out how do we understand these very large conversations. We have an opportunity to listen in a way and understand at a scale we haven't had in the past. So they did a case study of Black Lives Matter to try to trace how did that hashtag ignite and get into the public in a way that we all know it has been very influential, and everybody in this room knows what it is and has their own relationship with it, whether you just follow it on Twitter or know people who work in it or whatever. We have some connection here, probably all of us. So what they discovered was pretty interesting, that after Trayvon Martin's murder, his parents, I think, if I've got the details right, were talking to somebody who helped them get with somebody who worked in public relations so that they could understand how to let reporters know about what had happened. And so this person, I'm sorry I don't have the details, I didn't know I was going to tell the story, I would have had it here for you. The gist of it is that it just didn't happen. The igniting of the story, didn't just happen. Somebody pitched it to a reporter and pitched it to several reporters. And it got a little bit of news coverage, not a whole lot, but it got enough initially so that Color of Change could take hold of it. And Color of Change, which bills itself as the biggest online civil rights organization, was able to take that news coverage. Think about the tweets that we're talking about. They have links. What are they linking to? Where did the story come from? What is it that's being shared? So there's kind of a backstory to the hashtag itself taking off. And that backstory had to do with some news stories that told the story in a way that people could share. And from there, of course, it has taken off. And so I think that's there's some important lessons there, and we can learn from that. The other piece of that that's connected in my mind is the movement for Black Lives, which is a little bit different. But for those of you who've seen it, there's a fabulous website that I can't stop talking about just because I think it's so elegantly designed. And the Movement for Black Lives was a cultivation of activism and policy development that is now being carried out by people around the country. And the reason I'm so hot for this website, it's called, somebody told me that it's called this, I didn't even know I was talking about it, and they said, oh, that's Bite Snack Meal. And I said, what? What are you talking about? So, you guys know what I mean? So Bite Snack Meal. So let me describe this website, and you guys can go look at it. It's called Movement for Black Lives, I think .org, maybe .com, I don't remember. And when you go there and look at their policy agenda, there's like 6 boxes that come up with 1 word each, and 1 word's reparations, and 1 word's criminal justice, and 1 word's education, whatever it is. They've got 6, I think about 6 policy areas. So that's your bite. You get 1 word.
6 now. It was 4.
Oh, was it 4 and it's
Yeah,
6 now? Okay.
it's 6 now.
So when you roll over the box, and whatever the word is, reparations maybe, and then you get a sentence. So now you've got a word and then a sentence. If you click on the sentence, you get 6 bullet points. And if you click on a bullet point, you get the policy paper. It's deep, it's well thought out. It's been cultivated with community groups contributing their thoughts and their desires, much as we've been doing here today. So I think that's not nearly as visible as the hashtag Black Lives Matter. But these things are connected to each other because you need that policy oomph and you need people carrying it out, and that's the community organizing and the policy advocacy, and then the visibility in Twitter and elsewhere about Black Lives Matter that helps people understand this is an important story. Yes, there's an alternative narrative. Yes, there are other people who have the vision to take us to the world we need to be. All of that, I think, amplifies the detail and the policy depth that you see in the movement for Black Lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think so I love that you brought that one up, right? Because like I said, it used to be 4, now it's 6, or at least it was 6 the last time I looked. It might be 8 now. Because in the way that they're organizing the movement for Black Lives is this idea that it should be diasporic. And so it's not just a US-centered movement necessarily. So when you click on those bullet points that you get from the snack to the meal, is you get policy papers and things that are specific to different regional locations. Right, and so, which is really interesting concept. I loved it too when I saw it. I was like, you better get something happening with the world. Look at that, right? Because it does allow people to make a choice without being overwhelmed, but it's also a way for me, when I started looking at it, I started thinking about how you can interact, right? For me as a scholar, interacting with community groups who are looking for advice, right? And that's one of the pieces of advice that I would actually give is think about who your audiences currently are and who your audiences could be, right? And so the way that their website is set up with this idea that thinking about who their audiences are, the way they've designed their website is to think about an uninformed audience and an informed audience. So who is my uninformed audience? Who is my informed audience? So that's why you get that word, right? And then you get the sentence that hopefully entices both audiences to click. Then you get the bullet point, the different bullet points allow. When you actually look at them, there actually is a policy paper for the uninformed audience. There's a policy paper for the informed audience, right? Now the level and the amount of work that took, I can't even, right? But what that creates is it means that at the end, the uninformed and the informed audience can both get to one place where they can engage in an action. So the next thing after the policy paper, after you read through that bit, at the end, you're clicking on an action. So what are we now gonna do with this information now that we're in the same place, right? And so it's this idea that you don't have to start, your audience doesn't have to start in the same place to end in the same place, right? Which is a different way of messaging to your audiences that we've actually never seen before. And I think that's actually going to be the thing that makes the movement for Black Lives most successful, is that they already understand that their audiences are regionally broad or culturally broad or ethnically broad or nationally broad, and they're starting from informed and uninformed places. But they all want to get to actions that equal equity. And if they all want to get to actions that equal equity, how can they do that? How can we get everybody on the same page so that we can move forward, right? And so that's something that I think is really powerful about that particular page. I've seen it done by other groups. I think the movement for Black Lives benefits from the fact that you also have such a broad base of activists and intellectuals and different folks coming from different institutional backgrounds, where you have some folks who are working in nonprofit, some folks who are working in higher ed, some people that are working in government policy work. And so that means that you can have those folks who can source those policy papers and figure out what those different kinds of regional solutions or nationally based solutions, because what works in the UK is not going to work in the United States, right? And so that makes a big difference. But what I would say is the one takeaway you can take is to think about your what are the sort of three prime characteristics of your informed audience, the three prime characteristics of your uninformed audience. How do you bring information to them, right? So that you can get them to the same page where they want to work together to move forward as a movement. And if you can figure that out, then you can move your audience. You can move, and you can keep people engaged. I think that's the next thing about movements, is movements only work as long as there's people willing to move in them, right? As soon as nobody wants to move anymore, it's like, well, that's that, right? It's not a movement anymore, right? And so how do you keep people engaged and moving forward? And Goyland and I were talking about this, that I've been giving this a lot of thought lately. And one of the things that I realize is that there are some movements that do that really well because they celebrate every little milestone, right? They celebrate the movement of a comma. And you're like, dude, it's a comma, right? But they're out here with balloons and cupcakes because they got a comma somewhere. And you're just like, for real? Like, people are out here dying from poverty and you're celebrating a comma. But that's how you keep people engaged in these other, sort of on the other side of some of these movements, is because they're celebrating the smallest milestone. So that looks like progress to people. And then you message that celebration as progress. We got that long-awaited comma, right? So I use that as the example, but sometimes what we need to think about is, what is the milestone, however small, that we can celebrate, right? It's like little kids. When the little kid says their first word, everybody erupts in greater joy. Now, when they're talking full sentences and saying no to everybody, people are like, nah. But you celebrate those first happy words. Celebrating those progressive milestones in a movement is what also keeps a movement going. And so it's also about that, right? So celebrating, recognizing those benchmarks, celebrating the small ones, celebrating the big ones to keep people engaged and keep people moving forward.
I'd like to add, I think what we're talking about, and simultaneously what we're not saying, is the numbers. We're talking about numbers also. And I think movement work, a lot of time, we talk about messages, we talk about framing, we talk about content, we talk about communities, discourses, power, all those wonderful things. But we don't talk about numbers and data. And I think what Black Lives Matter has done for all of us, what this election has done for all of us, is to allow us to look more closely at numbers and how that impacts the way we have conversations. An example, Black Lives Matter has And specifically, I'm thinking about this in the context of polls and elections. So how does a candidate, win over 4 or 5 million popular votes, but still lose a national election? More specifically, let's get even smaller on local levels and state levels. How does it also happen that a candidate loses a national election in states that have significantly reduced voting opportunities? Right? And how are those states also reducing voting opportunities for people oftentimes of color, people who are most often under the margins, remove those sort of opportunities for people who are working multiple jobs, right? Remove those opportunities to vote for people who have life happen to them on set, right? Who are experiencing, no social safety net, right? What does that do? What are the consequences of that? So that's a numbers game. That's a numbers game. And once Black Lives Matter has sort of accented the ways we look at that and say, if we're really going to take serious the question of intersectionality, and I take that very seriously, I think we all do from what we said, I think we also have to start talking about quantitative analysis. And so I think how Toniesha has benefited me in this research partnership, I'm not a numbers person. I've been a rhetorical scholar since I've known what that was, and so I look at data, I look at content, I look at messages and analyze those messages, look at discourse. But I've been taking this a lot more serious since this election and looking at, well, if we know data and how data informs policy, right, in real, concrete ways, right, what can we do and how can we organize around numbers? An example of this, I think an organization and a person specifically who's done a lot of this work is, I don't know if you're familiar with William Barber. He's the president of the North Carolina NAACP. And William Barber has done, I can't think of the name of his organization right now. He started Moral Mondays. And he spoke at the Democratic National Convention. William Barber his organization has done a lot of work about making more visible the ways that numbers impact, right, have real terminal sort of impacts for those communities, not only those who are most at the margins, but also communities who have some type of privilege and who have a voice and who are able to do these things that we're enjoying right now. So I think a lot of this movement work has spillover effect where we're talking about that looking at university activists or student activists on campus. So a lot of times we're talking a lot more in the university about the role of adjunct pay or labor's unions, right, and how that affects, right, whether I have an opportunity to be a full professor or whether I have an opportunity, right, to do other things that have sort of financial impacts. And so I think bringing data to bear on movement work is an important move, I think, in the right direction that I think our research is beginning to really finally start dealing with in a serious way. One thing rhetorical scholars don't really like to talk about is we really push the quantitative data on the empirical folk. On the people who do empirical data and quantitative analysis, we're like, we don't do that. That's for them, right? But I think and I really appreciate Toniesha for this, is allowing me to really appreciate sort of mixed methods. Let's talk about mixed methods. Let's bring the numbers to bear with these narratives, with these stories. Because once we do that, then you have a more compelling case. You can make a compelling case when you have numbers and messages and stories, right? So I think that's very important. I think Black Lives Matter has been at the sort of forefront of accenting and highlighting those types of conversations, and I think that's just something that is really probably going to pick up from here.
Thank you so much. I want to open it up to the audience and ask anyone who has a question to raise their hand. No questions? I suspect everyone's ready for a coffee break.
Overwhelmed by information from the day and the afternoon.
All right, so let's break now. And it's 3:42, so we'll get back into our groups at 3:55. and then we just have one more session before we close out for the day. So thank you for hanging in there with us. And thank you so much to our panelists.